Thank you.
Let's just start with the formation of this new think tank, because I mean it says that there are about 503 think tanks in sub-Saharan Africa, and these are the ones that we know about. So this new think tank, how does it differ from everything else we have right now?
Okay, so this is actually a network of think tanks, with the participants and the coordinating unit being the South African Institute for International Affairs and the International Development Law Unit, which I head at the University of Pretoria. And we've formed this network of institutions throughout the continent to look at global economic governance and how it affects Africa, and particularly how it affects South Africa, which is because South Africa is the country that is a member of the G20, of the BRICS, of all the major institutions where global governance is being discussed.
So will the focus only be governance?
It'll be, yes, it'll be economic governance broadly defined. So we'll be looking at what are the issues on the agenda at the G20, what are the issues at the BRICS, how does South Africa represent South Africa in the G20 or the BRICS or the other UN or the World Bank and the IMF, and also how does it reflect African interests? Because South Africa is a member in its own right as an important country in the world, but because it's the only African country in these mechanisms, it has to advocate for African interests as well. And so that we think there's a role that we can play, because this is not just of interest to governments, it's of interest to civil society, the business community, labor. And so to have a think tank that thinks about these issues and can provide policy relevant information to governments and to other actors in society.
So what I would like to ask you, are there other African countries that are going to be part of this think tank?
At the moment we have about 6 different institutions, some of which are pan-African. So for example, the UN Economic Commission.
But are they from other African countries?
Yes.
The reason I ask you this is because why the focus, I mean, you have said about South Africa having this role in the G20, but why the focus so much on what's happening in South Africa and governance here when there are these other countries that are involved as well, and we're talking about the African continent?
Because the genesis of this is we've had a project for a number of years in working closely with National Treasury and the South African government, looking at some of the issues around G20 and looking at how to feed in civil society, very broadly defined, so business, labor, civil society views, and to communicate, to facilitate communications between government and these interests. But it's also because South Africa, as I said, is the only African country in these institutions. And as such, it has an obligation to advocate for African interests. And so for us to be able to do that effectively and to understand those interests and be able to convey them effectively, we need a network throughout the continent.
Well, one of the concerns has been, and I'm just going to read it, this is an actual quote, because this was the head of an initiative that had started on funding some of the think tanks on the African continent. And the quote says, most research in Africa is driven by the demands of external donors, leaving little room for innovation. And that's what some of the funders have seen. So how do we change that, just in terms of looking at what Africa needs and researching what Africa needs, not looking at what the external donor needs to find out about the continent?
Right. So that's our goal, is to do research and to promote research that is driven by African interests and needs. And so, for example, we have 2 research projects at the moment that are underway. One is to do a critical assessment of what the G20 is doing and how well that reflects African interests and how well it responds to African interests. And one of the things we'll be doing over the next year is looking at the official communiques and documents of the G20 to see to what extent they reflect African interests, and then doing an analysis and communicating through our network of think tanks to try and get the views of the continent, and then be able to reflect that in this critical assessment. And then we'll do that each year so that we'll be able to see, is it getting better or worse? We'll do it as a general project, and then we're also looking at how well the G20 will deal with food security and with financial sector issues. And then we also have a project on South Africa and the BRICS, which is looking at how well South Africa relates to the other BRIC countries, how they view South Africa, how Africa views South Africa's role in the BRICS. And that's driven by an African agenda. It's not what donors have asked us to do.
I would like to ask you, though, with all this research that is going to, once you've got that research, once you've got all this data, what do you do with it? Just in terms of, because I mean, at the end of the day, what you would like to see is this is what is happening, this is what would like to happen, how do we get there? So how does that process unfold?
So the research is the first step. Then we'll have an annual conference where we present our findings. But it's also important that we produce documents that are not only academic research, but that are relevant and interesting and useful for policymakers, and also that can be used through the media to educate the public about these issues, and hopefully to stimulate the public interest and media interest in responding and looking at these issues in more detail and saying how well is Africa being represented, so that we can become a source of stimulating information and not just a source of information.
So far in your experience, how much do policymakers and also business leaders take your information and actually use it?
Well, these are the first research projects that we've done through this project. Through other work that I've done or other people in the group have done, there's certainly been an interest. It's been read and the policymakers are aware of what we're doing. To what extent they use that is harder to say. But I think we find a very receptive ear. Treasury, for example, is very interested in the work we do. They're willing to come and they always come to the meetings we organize. So there is a discussion with Treasury, with other representatives.
How much action do you see, though? Because for them to attend the meeting, and it's different from them attending the meeting, engaging you and what can we do, and then actually following through and being able to put action to what they hear from you. Yeah. How much of that do you see happening?
That's much harder to gauge because the reality is, for example, in the G20, South Africa is one of 20 countries, and it's not the biggest and loudest voice in the room. So that it's a question of being able to feed South Africa, being able to go to those meetings fully prepared, and to be able to at least make sure that the African voice is heard. And we're still in the process of doing this research, so it's hard to say exactly what the outcome will be. But at least at a preliminary step, we can see that there's more focus and concern with Africa and with African issues in the G20.
How much of the research is about what's happening now, other than what to come? And what I'm asking you here is there are things that and some of the crises that we face, different African countries, the continent as a whole, where people say, in hindsight, we should have been able to see that. Why didn't we see it? There should have been research done, and things could have been put in place to stop that from happening. How much of that kind of research is taking place, do you think?
See, that's where a network like ours becomes so valuable, because for government, they're always responding to the next crisis. And as you know, over the last few years, there have been many global crises. So that we can step back and say, what's likely to become a more important issue in the medium term? And to say, here's why you should be thinking about that. Here's some ideas and policy options. And that's part of our discussion. And so that's part of what will come out of this project. To some extent, the immediate crises have to be responded to, but researchers and think tanks are better in a way in the medium term, and that's where I think we'll add a lot more value.
Professor Bradlow, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll be seeing more of you on the program, because as you unfold and come up with things that we do need to be taking a look at as a continent, thank you so much for coming in today.